What's going on, everybody? This is Afro Think Tank. Today, I'm going to bring you a special video where I give you an insight on where my ancestry in America comes from, about where my ancestry, where they were enslaved, not even 100 miles away from me in Lynchburg, Virginia. I'm one of the few African Americans in America who can trace his ancestries back to the plantation that we were enslaved in, and I also know the African that came from Africa to the Americas to that plantation. So I can directly trace my ancestry to the plantation in which my African ancestors were enslaved and worked for free. But I could also connected myself to where they sold the first male that will become my first African American ancestor, or the ancestor that had to work into slavery and then created the rest of the line, which, in turn created me and my family. And it's very rare that an African American know this much information about their enslaved African family in America. But it just so happens that the place that my family members were enslaved just happened to be a place of note. And it wasn't a massive, massive, well, it was a massive place, but it wasn't that many Africans that were placed into slavery compared to some other places, right? It wasn't as small because most people had, maybe most families could, maybe like rich families could afford maybe one or two Africans as slaves, because keep in mind, slavery back then was something for the rich. Only the rich could afford it. Like when you see people riding around in Lamborghinis and Bugattis, clearly only rich people can afford to drive those vehicles, as in only rich people can afford to buy an African and place them into bondage, right? So some places, upper middle class would have one or two, maybe a bigger corporation would have a few hundred. And then maybe the exception to the rule, you may have some places that had maybe thousands, right? But the place that I come from only had 100. So the majority of us are all related. We're all from this small little group. Not, like I said, not even 100 miles from Washington, D.C., in Lynchburg, Virginia. All right. So when y'all hear me say that I know, where I come from, I'm 100% sure that I'm African. It's not a belief. It's not something that I had to be like, I discover on social media. This is something I know from my family's genealogy and from my research, thanks to the diligent people within the different branches of my family, who do a lot of hard work to try to keep us connected and keep us knowing who we are. Right. So in my videos, those who have been riding me for a while, I always say that, I stood over the unmarked graves of my ancestors. Right? How many Africans can say that they have been able to pay homage to those your African ancestors that toiled in those fields for free and survived simply so that you can be here today? How many people have had that opportunity? How many African Americans have had that type of closure, to be able to properly thank and give honor to your ancestors who sacrificed themselves so that you can be alive? How many of us had an opportunity to do that, right? And that's why I ended up in my African journey, because I knew that my African ancestors who were taken into slavery, I know where they landed. I know what they dealt with. I know why they dealt with it. And I even know who the white European is and their family is, who still survive to this day, who they are. So I understand why I have, some of this light skin. I know where my light skin comes from. I heard the same story as everybody else. My grandmama is part Indian. Have you ever noticed it's always the grandmother or the great grandmother who's part Indian? And they never say the grandfather. You ever notice that? You ever notice always the grandmama? It's because she's the one who grew her hair out. And because it was not kinky curly C4, but maybe kinky curly C3, they were able to get away with it because of the shame of what these plantation owners did to our women. The reason why we have all these people pretending to be Native Americans, despite the fact that we do have African Americans who are in fact part Native Americans, but they're being drowned out by those African Americans who, in their true history, their grandmamas, their great grandmamas or whatever, were molested by that white master that brings shame upon their family. Just like anytime you hear about a woman being raped, obviously that woman feels shame, even though she's the victim. She feels shame, and that's why a lot of these occurrences don't get these people who get away with the raping. They get away with it because of the shame it brings upon the person that's being violated. Therefore, as a community, as a society, as a race, our women has been violated by these Europeans who are not superior to us in any way, but because they had the advantage of the gun cannon and the white supremacy infrastructure that they have built, they were able to take advantage of our women. So because of our women and that shame of being constantly raped by the person that you hate, the person that beats you, that beats your husband, that beats your son, that sold your husband, that sold your son, then rapes you and keeps you as a trophy, and then sometimes impregnates you and then sells off his son to another plantation so that he doesn't have to look at the fruits of his evil ways, is his evil labor, right? So without further ado, I have put together a small little thing, a little story, so you can learn about the plantation that my ancestors come from, which, like I said, is only 100 miles. Most of African Americans live about, unless they migrated during the Great Migration from the South to the North, most African Americans live about 100 miles away from where their African ancestors were enslaved. They just have no idea where the plantation is or the family or anything. It's just everything's been mixed up and discombobulated as history has continued to move on, and certain groups of people try to erase this type of information from academia. But anyway, without further ado, this is Afro Think Tank. Learn something, teach something. I'm out.
Sweet Briar College and its plantation history. Overview of Sweet Briar College. Location: Sweet Briar, Virginia, near Lynchburg. Type: private women's liberal arts college. Founded 1901. Motto: Rosem que meruit ferat. She who has earned the rose may bear it. Endowment: $88 million as of 2024. Campus size: approximately 3,250 acres, featuring historic buildings, equestrian facilities, and a nature preserve. Academics: Sweet Briar offers a strong liberal arts curriculum with notable programs in equestrian studies, engineering, environmental science, and creative writing. History of Sweet Briar Plantation. The land was originally part of a plantation owned by the Fletcher family, who enslaved black people for labor. The plantation grew crops like tobacco and other goods. Elijah Fletcher, a prominent local figure, acquired the property in the 19th century. Daisy Williams, the daughter of Elijah Fletcher, was the last heir to the property. She passed away at a young age, and her mother, Indiana Fletcher Williams, later bequeathed the land and funds to establish the college in her daughter's memory. Enslaved people on the plantation. The Sweet Briar Plantation relied heavily on enslaved labor. Historical records document the lives and work of the enslaved individuals, but much of their history remains fragmented. The college has undertaken efforts in recent years to acknowledge and preserve the history of the enslaved community through research and initiatives like memorialization and educational programs. Notable features of the college. 1. Historic campus buildings. The campus architecture reflects the plantation's history, with buildings like Fletcher Hall and the Sweet Briar House, formerly the plantation's main house. 2. Memorialization of enslaved individuals. In 2017, the college installed a monument honoring the enslaved people who lived and worked on the plantation. 3. Equestrian program. Sweet Briar has one of the nation's most respected equestrian programs, with extensive riding facilities. 4. Focus on sustainability and conservation. The large campus includes forests, wetlands, and meadows, which support conservation and environmental education. Cultural and historical legacy. Sweet Briar College's origin as a plantation presents a dual legacy. It is both a prestigious institution for women's education and a site with a complex history of slavery and inequality. Efforts to reconcile this history include collaborations with descendants of the enslaved and academic studies, exploring race, identity, and heritage. Slavery history of Sweet Briar Plantation. The Sweet Briar Plantation, which later became the site of Sweet Briar College, was deeply tied to the institution of slavery. Here's a detailed account of its slavery history. Origins of the plantation. The land that became Sweet Briar was owned by Elijah Fletcher. a northern-born educator who moved to Virginia in the early 19th century. Fletcher established himself as a prominent plantation owner in Amherst County, where he enslaved dozens of African Americans to work the land, maintain the household, and generate wealth for his family. The plantation primarily produced tobacco, which was labor-intensive and relied heavily on enslaved people. The enslaved community. The enslaved population on the Sweetbriar Plantation performed a range of duties, including agricultural labor, household service, carpentry, blacksmithing, and child rearing. Records indicate that the plantation enslaved at least 100 individuals during its peak. Many enslaved individuals lived in cabins on the property, which were often located away from the main house to maintain segregation while ensuring their labor was easily accessible. Family legacy and Indiana Fletcher Williams. Elijah Fletcher's daughter, Indiana Fletcher Williams, inherited the plantation. She continued to benefit from the wealth created by enslaved labor, even after slavery was abolished in 1865. The plantation shifted to tenant farming and sharecropping post-emancipation, systems that perpetuated economic inequality for formerly enslaved people and their descendants. Impact of slavery on Sweetbriar's foundation. Sweetbriar College was established in 1901 by Indiana Fletcher Williams in memory of her daughter, Daisy Williams. The college's endowment and physical infrastructure were derived from the profits of the plantation's operations, which were built on the labor of enslaved people. As such, the wealth that made the college's founding possible was directly tied to slavery, documenting the enslaved. The college has preserved some records, such as account books, letters, and plantation inventories, which provide glimpses into the lives of the enslaved people. However, much of their history remains undocumented. Efforts are being made to uncover and acknowledge the stories of the enslaved individuals who lived and labored on the plantation. Recent memorialization efforts. In 2017, Sweetbriar College dedicated a monument to honor the memory of the enslaved people who worked on the plantation. The monument is located near the Sweetbriar House, the former plantation house, and lists the known names of enslaved individuals. The college has also engaged in research and educational programs to better understand and teach this history. Known enslaved individuals. Some names of the enslaved people gathered from historical documents include Patsy Fletcher, a skilled domestic worker and caregiver; Sam, a field hand mentioned in plantation accounts. Many others remain unnamed or known only through partial records. Legacy and reconciliation. The college continues to grapple with its historical ties to slavery. This includes partnerships with descendants of the enslaved, historical research, and community discussions. The enslaved people at Sweetbriar Plantation, like those across much of Virginia, were primarily descendants of Africans who were forcibly brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. These enslaved individuals came from various regions of West and Central Africa, including modern-day countries such as 1. Senegal; 2. The Gambia; 3. Ghana; 4. Nigeria; 5. Benin; 6. Angola; 7. The Congo region. How they arrived in Virginia. 1. The transatlantic slave trade, active from the 17th to the 19th centuries, forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas. 2. Many enslaved Africans were sold through coastal ports in Africa by local leaders or captured by European traders. 3. They endured the brutal Middle Passage, a journey across the Atlantic Ocean, where countless lives were lost due to inhumane conditions. 4. Once in Virginia, enslaved individuals were sold at markets like those in Richmond and Charleston, the domestic slave trade. By the time Sweetbriar Plantation was operating in the early 19th century, the international slave trade had been outlawed, 1808 in the U.S. However, the domestic slave trade within the United States expanded to supply plantations in the Upper South, such as Sweetbriar, with enslaved laborers. Enslaved individuals at Sweetbriar were likely born in the U.S. and descended from Africans brought over during earlier periods of the slave trade. Many were purchased at auctions in Virginia or inherited through family estates like that of Elijah Fletcher. The legacy of these enslaved Africans and their descendants remains central to the history of Sweetbriar Plantation. Would you like more details on the transatlantic slave trade or how slavery was tied to Virginia's economy? Efforts to incorporate this history into the college's identity. emphasize the need for truth-telling and acknowledgement of past injustices.